Hey y'all, welcome back to the Tripod 2500, the official YouTube channel for the Tripod podcast. If it's your first time here, welcome. And to everyone else, welcome back. On this channel, I do book reviews of Trinity University Press publications and other related titles. This channel is meant to supplement the podcast by taking a deeper dive into the works of Tripod guests. So for today's Tripod review, I will be covering the TU Press publication On the Sponge Islands Loss and Restoration in the Aegean by Julia Martin. This book, let's start with the summary. This book just recently came out, and it is my most recent podcast episode. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to it, it just came out. So go check that out. And if you were curious to learn more about the book or you haven't had a chance to make a purchase of it yet, then this is a great video for you to watch. So let's start with the summary. So this summary is mostly taken from the TU Press website. So this is the summary. On the Sponge Islands is a nonfiction natural history about Julia Martin's visits to the Greek islands of the Dodecanese, which are also known as the Sponge Islands. This includes Rhodes, Simi, Halki, Kilmenos, and Patmos. I apologize if that's not the best pronunciation of those. But they have a rich ecological legacy of diving, selling, and trading sponges, like what you would use to wash your body, to wash your dishes before the artificial sponges became the go-to product. But now they're still sold for like artisanal purposes and certainly used on the islands, but not as easy to produce, obviously, which is where sponge diving comes in. Through the innovations in the late 19th century, sponge diving started to bring home just untold wealth, millions that these divers would earn by going to the seafloor, either free diving or with the innovations of the 19th century, that big metal diving suit. You might see it in like cartoons. It's just that big hulking metal suit, big circular helmet with the glass face. So, with that innovation, people were now able, mostly men, were able to walk the bottom of the ocean and just cut sponges, off the seafloor to bring back to the island and um, sell for any purposes that others might need. So with that, people started bringing home millions, building mansions on these islands and great, livestock farming, all that. But that could only last so long because the seafloor was getting damaged and it came at the cost of many lives. Sorry, this is definitely expanded summary, but I'm just adding a little clarification since I won't really dive, no pun intended, into those details. But if you listen to the episode, we cover a lot more in depth of how that invention came to be and the consequences and such. Um, but I'll move on. So it came at the cost of many lives, and over 3 visits, Martin meets many people whose lives are just bound to the sea. They might be, great grandchild of a famous diver who maybe lost life and limb to be diving and collecting sponges. Um, and through meeting these people through their stories, whether it's, a lifelong diver, great grandson of a diver, a daughter, wife, you name it, she uncovers sort of the rise and fall of that empire, the sponge trade, and its environmental devastation that carried out, in shockwaves, not just on the islands, but further out than that, obviously, with the environmental impact. And yet, for all of the plunder, everything the sea suffered, it's still she constantly emphasizes its beauty, it's luminous and alive, and conversations with the islanders keep returning to the heart and the emotional connection to the sea and the islands and the history. And so On the Sponge Islands brings together natural history and eco-social reckoning. Martin has just this lyrical, searching prose that's rich in dialogue, great characters, and great tales that these characters tell. And while the devastation is definitely palpable and well described, the story really ends, well, not even ends. Throughout the book, through these conversations, um, there's hope, there's renewal and innovation, and it's a really uplifting but eye-opening story. So that's the summary in long and short. I definitely added a lot to the TU Press summary, but in this review, we will move on to the structure and writing portion of the review. So, as I mentioned sort of briefly, Julia Martin has this lyrical prose, which in our episode, she is very appreciative of that compliment, because she talks about, like, singing and music a lot in the book and exploring the islands in that cultural connection. It just has that really moving prose where you feel like you're reading poetry for half the book. Also has this great combination of rich dialogue in meeting these really interesting people, these interesting characters, but also so much well-researched history about the island, the culture, facts about the market of the trading the sponges and things like that. Just so much information. But again, it's broken up with these beautiful dialogue, these descriptions of the landscape, and of course, like the touristy and non-touristy things that Julia and her partner encountered. So it follows that timeline of her visit. And I don't know if it's the amount of times or just how dedicated she was to meeting these people and really diving into conversations, but the deep messages are very clearly explained. She's also a professor, so I feel like she just has that brain of being able to explain a very abstract concept and bring it into a metaphor or an experience that really helps illustrate the messaging. So I really appreciated that. I've said this multiple times in these reviews and such, but I am still just getting into nonfiction, and writers like this who can really explain something for me without having me have to go look up 8 different scientific studies. I really appreciate it. It helps the book still feel like I'm just reading and following a story rather than experiencing a lecture. So, it doesn't read as a travel log either. It feels like you're discovering the islands with Julia. You're kind of walking there beside her, and it feels like you are speaking to these people as she is. Moving on from the structure and writing portion, I wanna get into the takeaways, which I break down into people, place, and planet as we do in the podcast with my questions. So let's start with the people takeaways that I had from both my conversation with Julia, but also just from reading on the Sponge Islands. First, through all the topics, many of the conversations return to this notion of the heart. It's it's not described any other way other than the heart. And I found that very interesting that Julia didn't choose to translate that. The heart is just the human connection element that you get from just having a conversation face to face with somebody that you don't know, who has a completely different life perspective than you do. And talking about how you connect in the heart through art, through music, singing, dance, like the cultural arts that are able to encompass so much more. There's no other way to put it, and I'm glad she didn't try to put some other more analytical word on it because there is that just sense you feel when you're talking to an old friend or a new friend and you're making that connection for the first time or reigniting a connection, and she talks about how so many of the conversations turn back to that, and they overcome language barriers and the distance of just oceans apart. So, that was really enjoyable to experience throughout the conversations, just the compassion and empathy that the islanders, but also Julia as a visitor share. So, that was a really fresh reminder of to be compassionate to your fellow person. In addition to that, there was a lot of discussion around aging and legacy and youth versus, wisdom and things like that. Because on the island, many of the older population have been there their entire lives. They have not left. So they have such wisdom and so much knowledge about their environment, about these islands, about the ocean, what it means, how it can change you. And the younger people are not as invested in, living off the land, right? As most young populations are. People are going to the supermarket rather than growing their own food or ordering things to be shipped to you, right? It's not like these islands are off completely disconnected from the world. They still have the modern innovations that we all rely on, and so the older population sees this as a problem that capitalism and industrialism is destroying things, which of course it has its negative impacts. But the younger people are also free to not necessarily be tethered to one place, or they get to experience commodities and other things from other parts of the world. So there's that weird dissonance, but also so much reverence for the older population that I think many other places don't have. We talk a lot about ageism and things like that, and older people just being less and less able to connect to the world around them because technology is so foreign. It's not a language they grew up speaking. So there's a great quote in there, which isn't an original quote from this person, but they say, "As you are now, we once were. As we are now, you will be too," which I believe Julia's husband correctly identifies as a Shakespeare quote. I could be totally wrong in that, but regardless, the quote is just kind of like, "We all will be older, we all will age, and those who have aged were once young." So, I thought that was such a great, it's kind of the memento mori sort of messaging. It's maybe cliche, but to respect those who are older than you, who have experienced more, but also to love your youth and be kind to yourself because you still have so much to learn. So I thought that was a nice people-based takeaway to just be kind to the young, the old, all the in between because we've all had such different experiences. And lastly, this was a really interesting dynamic that we talked about, which I think I kind of maybe brought it up more because maybe as a younger reader or audience member, I felt sort of invested in this. But there was a discussion around the gender roles, sort of the islands, because I approached it as this culture of maybe like a toxic masculinity or machismo, thing like that, because the men, almost all men, are the divers, right? They leave the island for months at a time to go and often not return or return completely changed, unable to walk or care for their families anymore because they suffered this critical emergency condition where if you are, come back to the surface from too much pressure, it can make you really sick and it can cause limbs to not get enough circulation, so you have to amputate, things like that. So it's a very critical thing that many divers experienced and then came home changed. And so the women, while the men were away from half the year essentially for the season to farm the sponges, they're taking care of the island, their families, the livestock, the farms, these mansions that have been left behind. And then when the boats come home, they don't know if their husband is gonna be there or not, or their brother, their uncle, whoever is not gonna be there. So, I came to it with the impression that this is toxic, right? It's everyone is suffering. The women are suffering loss. They're being shouldered with this responsibility, and the men are losing their lives because there's been this ideal created that you have to risk your life to dive in the ocean and blah, blah, blah. But Julia pointed out a really interesting nuance that is important that I think really I've only experienced this kind of discussion in this particular book. And it's that in like paper mill towns, right? Or coal mining districts, that is a plagued by toxic masculinity, right? That notion of these men are going to do this work that is damaging to them physically, mentally, everything, and they're not being paid enough. Not enough to support their families, and obviously that causes a myriad of physical and mental ailments. And the women, children, whoever is being provided for is also suffering because of this notion that you have to go sacrifice yourself and that intellectual or artistic endeavors are not as valuable. And that's not anybody's fault. It's just survival, right? It's what's available to them. And yeah, just any industrial based community that suffers, right? But Julia explained because I brought up that I thought of that parallel while I was reading the book, and she said that it doesn't seem from her conversations, toxic is not the right word. Yes, there is this heroism that's given to these divers for what they do and risking their lives, and they've become this like pinnacle of manhood and just human like Greek god level, right? That they've conquered the deep. Um, there is that element. However, they were bringing back millions of dollars by going and doing these feats, right? So, although they might be sacrificing so much and leaving women to be responsible of all this with very little credit, they were bringing back ample salary and more, right? So the women were then provided for. They did have these beautiful homes and farms, and the children got to grow up in a safe and wealthy area, very wealthy at the time when this was a booming industry. So it wasn't that these men were going just sacrificing for the sake of sacrifice and legacy. It was because it really did bring a profit. And also, she was talking to people who've lost arms, legs, brothers, family members to sponge diving, and they just say like, "Oh, if I could dive just one more time, if I was just I would love to go back to the sea and just be, submerged in this other world." You're not gonna hear that from somebody working at a chemical plant or in a coal mine. On their deathbed, they're not saying, "I wish I could be back down in the mines again." No, because it's damaging and it's dark and it's dirty and it's cruel. But the ocean is like this beautiful other world. I felt like it was akin to being like an astronaut. So, there isn't that element of just being in this, like, hellish place. It's something that these men admire and idolize their entire lives. So, I found that to be very interesting. There's this great discussion around gender roles, and even the very opening chapter is about that metal diving suit of the early 19th century, and the men were all afraid to try it. They were like, "This looks like a hell machine." And so the inventor asked, or hopefully politely asked, but we don't know, for his pregnant wife to put the suit on and show that it was safe and successful, and she did. So that was, a great feat of just a woman sticking it, to the guys, being like, "Yeah, this is safe and I'm brave." So, there's, just so much, such a great theme about gender and feminism and masculinity. Was it toxic? Is it not? So, I really enjoyed our conversation about that, and I think everyone should kind of take a look at this example and on the Sponge Islands because it is a really interesting nuance. But I'll move on to the place-based takeaways, which I have to obviously note that these islands are beautiful, right? They're just surrounded by this blue sea, which Julia often describes just being just so gorgeous. And it is very now reliant on tourism, naturally. But there are, through discussing that and meeting, fellow tourists, but also people who've lived on the islands their whole lives, Julia kind of talks about there's very good ways to be a tourist and ways you can be a tourist in your own home. It's easy when you're in a new location to have this whole new perspective on the world. Just everything is more beautiful, more blue, more alive because it's new, right? You've never seen it and you have just your observational glasses on because you want to remember everything. And on that notion of being a good tourist, admiring the place you are and valuing it is a great way to start. But also, Julia noted that actually speaking to people and wanting to know the culture and the population, not just the beauties of the landscape, right? Seeing this place for everything it is, trying to be a local is a great way to be a tourist. And the idea of being a tourist in your own home is, even though it's, you see your house or your street every day, looking at it with eyes like you're touring your own hometown, it can really bring some fresh excitement and renewed joy about the place that you live. And then secondly, to be knowledgeable about the place you live and your history because Julia talking to these young people, it could have very easily been like a yes no conversation, but these young people know so much about the history because they do live closely with the older population. But that's not impossible to do in modern cities, right? Know your neighbors, go speak to somebody. It might be an older person who's lived in that house forever and they can tell you like the best restaurant to go to or that this street maybe used to be like the best place in downtown. And imagining that these young people Julia spoke to didn't know anything, this would be a very short book. So it just really teaches you the value of knowing the history and the people of your place. So with that being said, I'll move on to the planet takeaways, which are the last few. So, firstly, Julia's book is described as explaining how beauty and suffering are often inextricable, which Julia, yes, does an excellent job of showing this because she talks about seeing these gorgeous views, right? These beautiful landscapes, but then, 2 feet away is like a donkey or a dog that's chained up and yelping and crying out, and being mistreated. So there's this beautiful landscape and then suffering right beside you, which I think all of us can think about every day. We might have a fantastic day or gone to see some beautiful thing, and then you come home and you watch the news and you're like, damn, right? It's hard. They are inextricable. We are privileged to experience beauty comes at a cost. And I think Julia does a great job of showing that, those things wouldn't be as beautiful if we didn't have that counterpart and that counterpart is valuable in that way. So that I think is just a reminder that everyone needs to have that it's important to find the beauty and to know it's valuable because it's not the same for everyone. And similarly, they talk about how industrialization and capitalism, has wreaked havoc on these islands. And an islander notes that the apocalypse can happen to anyone and freedom is tenuous, which I think is very closely tied to the previous takeaway. The apocalypse, if you want to call it that, or just a rough time, is kind of happening to all of us. And your freedom is tenuous. Things can change all the time. And it doesn't have to be broad scale. It just, you might lose a job. You might, miss out on an investment or, a family member is sick, things like that. I mean, your ability to do what you want when you want is tenuous. So, not to be like YOLO or like live in the moment, right? But just the little victories really do count. The little things are as important as the big successes, and you should celebrate them because if the end is nigh, then every day counts. But it doesn't have to be that dismal. It's just things can change quickly, and so it's important to stay in the moment and have hope. And on that notion of hope, another great quote was just that action is impossible without hope. And this book really offers a great vision of the future that these islanders are trying to create of, sustainable farming and sustainable power, things like that, and community and compassionate community. So there is hope. There are places that are working hard to do better. And you can be that person and make that place too. So, but you have to take action, right? Sitting and thinking about it is not enough to make hope. You have to see it happen, things in action. That's hope. So that was my final planet takeaway and my final takeaway of the review. And I like to leave off with just a few questions that you can consider and something that I want to consider after reading this book. So, firstly, how can you sort of rage against the machine? Which this notion is brought up because of that big metal suit, right? They called it Satan's machine because it did such damage to their environment. And there were people who decided to just live more naturally, live with the island, not strike against it. So, how can you sort of rage against in that sense? How can you choose to live more simply or more naturally, environmentally conscious? Things like that. What can you do? And secondly, how will you look for the little things? What can you think positively about right now that you should be joyful about? And lastly, what makes you hopeful? Because having hope is very powerful. So consider what makes you hopeful. And if you don't have a good answer for that, think on it and try and find new things that bring you hope. So, with that, that was my review of On the Sponge Islands. I hope you enjoyed. And please listen to the podcast episode with Julia Martin. It's a great conversation. You'll learn a lot more if you found this review interesting. And that's all. Bye.